Hi, and welcome to another episode of NXIVM on Trial, a Times Union podcast about the shadowy organization known as NXIVM, and more specifically, the second season of HBO's documentary series, The Vow. I am Casey Seiler, editor-in-chief of the Times Union, and I'm happy to be joined by
Jessica Marshall, multimedia producer and producer of NXIVM on Trial.
Robert Gavin, I am the Times Union's Cops and Courts reporter, and I cover the trial of Keith Raniere.
And we are talking now about the fifth episode of season 2 of The Vow, the penultimate episode, not only of this season, but of the series, unless something really weird happens, I suppose. The title of this episode is The Room, and it focuses on the fairly explosive testimony of a young Mexican woman who, along with many other members of her family, was drawn into NXIVM and ended up spending months. 2 years, Rob, is that right?
It went from March 2010 until February 2012.
After she committed what Keith Raniere described as yet another one of the ethical breaches that the women who he was romantically involved in were prone to when they disappointed him. Rob, why don't you were in the court as you were for the whole trial. Can you talk a little bit, as you have previously, about Lauren Salzman and other kind of key witnesses? Where did the testimony of this young woman, who we will identify as Daniela, fall within the trial, and what was the impact on the jury?
This was probably the most important witness at the trial, arguably the same as Lauren Salzman. Daniela is the woman who was kept in the room for 22 months. And the reason she's kept in the room is because she kissed another member of NXIVM. That's the reason. And she testified. It was extremely powerful because you have Lauren, and then right after Lauren, you have, I believe she was the next witness. And Daniela was on the stand for several days. It's really hard to describe, honestly, because as powerful as last night's episode probably was to people who saw it, it was way more so in person, and the actual details were actually far more egregious than we even saw.
Jess, I'll throw this question to you. I think of really all the episodes of The Vow that we've seen so far, this one kind of took the most chances aesthetically, wouldn't you say, just in the telling of it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there was extensive use of animation beyond the courtroom to describe, the circumstances and the scene as, through Daniela's testimony. There was a heavy use of this kind of dark, shadowy animation that I found pretty effective, at least in helping to visualize some of the darker elements of her testimony as it was described in this episode. It also used a lot of graphical treatments, kind of these interludes in between people's statements where there were these kind of twinkling lights that were a little out of focus and some sort of linear graphical elements. They were these interstitial elements that I think helped kind of keep the pacing of the story really dramatic, in addition to the testimony itself, which was pretty dramatic. So I thought the use of those elements was pretty effective in telling this story.
I've criticized the show before for excessive use of the first person, but here, oddly enough, considering that it was largely one woman's testimony and her point of view, I thought they did a really good job of depicting that and also backing that up with kind of a chorus of other voices, including Karen Unterreiner, who was a NXIVM insider who was tasked by Keith Raniere with counseling Daniela, and Moira Penza, of course, the lead federal prosecutor. I did not need any Nancy Salzman in this episode unless they were going to ask her what she knew about Daniela being cosseted in the room for that long, which maybe you guys heard it and I didn't, but at no point did they seem to kind of say, hey, did you know about this? Were you cool with it?
At Nancy Salzman's sentencing, the mother of Daniela, and this is the mother of Daniela's younger sister, who also was obviously the sex crime victim at 15 of Keith Raniere. She spoke of how Nancy Salzman, being a mother, jabbed her finger into her chest to let her know just how valuable Keith Raniere's time was, and that he's worth X amount of time, and really talked down to her. One of the children was basically working for Nancy in her home. So this is a little bit of revisionist history there to act like she's all sympathetic to the family, because she certainly was aware that there was members of that family working and not being paid necessarily like they should. Everybody else in the NXIVM inner circle knew something was going on, including her daughter, who obviously was directly involved in Daniela's her quote unquote boot camp. You'll notice that term used again, same as it was for Das in the trial. It came out as boot camp, or this was going to be some sort of severe sanction for this huge ethical breach, which the show didn't show. But when Keith was talking to the mother, what he actually said to her was he tried to equate it to the killing of a child. He said, if someone killed a child, would that be okay to just say, oh, you're sorry or whatnot? If she had done this, would that be this huge dishonor? And then Moira Penza had asked Daniela, had you killed a child? She said, no, I kissed Ben Myers. Because that was the trend, the huge ethical breach that Daniela made was to kiss another man not named Keith Raniere. And then she told him about it. And Keith was, as she says in the show, and this is what she said on the witness stand, she considered Keith a close personal friend. She confides in him. She kissed this person. And he decides to react as Raniere does, just with this huge reaction of, you've done this unbelievable thing that cannot be cured. One thing that did not come out, which is interesting, is he told the mother that Daniela was the person who was arranging books in Raniere's executive library in Knox Woods. And because now she's being punished, he said, so now I can't buy books, because he was punishing her. So there was just this completely warped overreaction. It just went completely nuclear.
Two of my favorite clips of Raniere from this episode was the discussion with the mother, in which he was basically talking as if he's a high school guidance counselor, talking to a parent and saying, well, she's spoiled. She likes to get her own way. She's willful. And this is Keith Raniere saying this, right? A classic sort of rubber glue defense, I think you might call it. And also a moment when they are lounging on the sofa and Keith is playing her Led Zeppelin. And
that was really uncomfortable.
it was so weird. And
Keith loves Led Zeppelin. That's something I don't know that a lot of people know, because we saw the dancing outside the jail and a lot of dance music. But from what I understand, Keith's a big Zeppelin guy. One
of the exhibits that I probably spent way too much time going over was the inventory of Keith Raniere's record collection, and man, a lot of prog rock, a ton of prog rock, and it was included in the federal exhibits. And speaking as a former rock critic, it was really kind of fascinating to go through. I think we talked a couple of episodes ago about seeing Ayn Rand and Dune on the shelf, and no offense to prog rock fans, but man, he was way into that stuff.
I think when people watch this episode, they're going to be very appalled at what happened to Daniela. And some things that were just not mentioned, just so the people who are hearing this podcast know, is there was a very serious tooth condition that Daniela had. She had diarrhea, other issues, like serious health issues that were just not being treated. And eventually they had to bring Daniela out to a dentist because it was a partial loss of a tooth. There was also a part in confinement where Daniela escaped. And by the way, this was on Wilton Court in the Knox Woods townhouse development in Half Moon. So if you get an idea where it is, it's like basically off 236 off of Route 9. At one point, she gets out during her confinement, makes it all the way to the Walmart on Route 9 in that Half Moon Clifton Park area, and she's trying to call Ben Myers, and he doesn't get it. Eventually, she ends up going back to the room. And the other part was that when she wrote these items, these quote unquote book reports, what's really interesting is she had this little thing she called the Wilton Times because it was on Wilton Court, and she would write these little stick figures and write these little reports, and eventually that was considered being indulgent. So while you're in a room in your house, and yeah, I know Mark Agnifilo obviously was trying his best to try to downplay this as a defense attorney, but this is someone who has no means of getting out. She doesn't have any ID.
They've
She's
got
in
her
the country
papers.
illegally at this point. She's basically trapped there. No, the door's not locked, but where is she going to go? And her family is there, and she's someone whose family is extremely important to her. In fact, a huge amount of love that comes out for her family when she's there. And you really can't overstate how intelligent Daniela is and how clear that came across in her testimony. And one of the letters she wrote while she's there, this was chilling to me as someone who was covering the trial, because you think, like, what would you do in that situation like that, right? And there's one part where she writes in capital letters, "Do you realize how insane this is? What is wrong with all of you? How is this good for me? I just want this to be over." And she writes another one, "Please, Keith, I don't want to be here anymore. Please, please." So, I mean, she's doing what you would expect any normal person would do. She was a young person. She kissed someone. That's all she did. Now, you asked earlier about people who talked about how did Nancy know about this. I mean, Ben Myers, the guy she kissed, is now married to the other Salzman sister. And so he's, the person she kissed, Ben, is Nancy Salzman's son-in-law. So, I mean, there's a big circle sometimes of all, you don't go too far in NXIVM without, hitting a circle of some kind. There was a lot of evidence there about what you're going to hear next week in the finale, I think, too, about that she knew about Keith's relationship with her younger sister, who had all kinds of other issues there and was known to be bulimic and had other,
and underage.
Underage, obviously.
Yeah.
But also, Keith also groomed Daniela. She might have been of age, but he groomed her. He kissed her. What did not come out in the episode is the scene where he says he put her on the mattress and whatnot. There's a scene in that later where there's an interaction between him and her. And he gaslights Daniela in telling her, "Oh, we had sex." And she's like, "No, we didn't." And he's like, "Oh, yeah, we did." And he has this sort of gaslighting to her, which, they literally had a psychology expert come on and testify about what gaslighting is. And if you don't know what it is, it's trying to make someone think they're going nuts when they're not, and thinking up is down and down is up. And,
no, Rob, I don't think that's what gaslighting is, actually.
Yeah. So, and that's a big part of what happened with Daniela. And in the room, here you have this young woman who has done nothing other than, how dare she kiss another man. And I know I said this in the last few episodes. Keith Raniere is sleeping with more than 20 women in NXIVM and one person who's not a woman yet. So this the sheer hypocrisy. And Daniela was punished for cutting her hair in the room. And by the way, she's not even the only woman in NXIVM who was punished for cutting her hair. Keith had done that to at least one other woman that I know of. It's like a dictatorship and these crazy rules. And how could anybody not commit an ethical breach in the world of Keith Raniere?
The way the episode was structured and how it went through her testimony, I think really was effective for me anyway, when you juxtapose it with some of the other characters like Nancy and Karen and the people who are kind of reacting as it happened. You saw the emails from Lauren Salzman, and it just kind of blows your mind because, confining someone to a space, I mean, we've all heard the horror stories about people who are abducted and, confined in these very small spaces. There was that movie called Room that was based on a book. Just a very, very disturbing situation to kind of, to anybody. And then you hear their reactions and it's almost like Karen and Nancy were kind of shrugging their shoulders.
I have spoken before that one of my bugaboos about the vow is that it gives, speaking as the editor of the Times Union, that it gives short shrift to the Times Union. I think I can be forgiven for that. But here I think I have a point on that front. And this is something that isn't brought up in the vow, wasn't really brought up that much in the federal trial either. But I would point out one thing about the timing of Daniela's confinement, and that is that it ended in February of 2012 when they decided that she needed to get out of town. And she was driven down to the U.S.-Mexico border and basically kind of dumped there. That same month, second Sunday of February, the Times Union published the major component of Secrets of NXIVM, which is the Jim Odato, Jennifer Gish investigation specifically about Raniere's shabby and potentially illegal relationships and treatment of young women within NXIVM. Now, I can't prove it. Nobody has ever been able to get people in NXIVM to talk about it, as far as I know, at least. But one has to imagine, I don't think it's a crazy hypothesis to think that NXIVM knew this series was coming, and certainly when it was published on February 11th, if you were anyone within NXIVM, you might think, hey, you know what? After this publication, maybe it would be a good idea in case any local, state, or federal investigators might want to look further into this group based on this reporting. Maybe we ought to get this young woman out of town, considering that we have kept her prisoner for 2 years. Of course, what they didn't know is that, as far as we know, none of those law enforcement entities did jack squat.
Yeah, it's really disturbing. I mean, you look at the way, because she had gotten out of the room once before, and then she went back in the room. And then this time she's on the brink of suicide. And this came out of trial where she sees the red bird, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, I want to live. She gets out. She storms out of the room. I mean, storm's a strong word. She confronts Keith at volleyball. I don't think this was in the episode, but she confronts Keith at volleyball, and they're all there. And Keith runs to the back of like the group of people. So if you're familiar with Keith, you know, this is not the first time he's acted this way. You know, when he got, or I should say at that time, it was similar to the way he acted when he was arrested, where he hid in the closet. Daniela confronts him in the gym when they're playing volleyball. He runs to the back, says, I'm leaving. And at this point, they decide, well, rather than go back in the room, the father, another top member of NXIVM, drive her to the border with 0 immigration documents, drop her off, and eventually she gets to Mexico, and by some like miracle, she ends up getting to a library. Because she's a citizen, she gets ID. And you want to know a part which is I just find amazing here. NXIVM still was expecting Daniela after she left in Mexico to write quote unquote book reports. And Daniela ends up getting employment. She works at a high boutique hotel in Mexico. And of all the hotels in all of the world that she could work at, this hotel is where Emiliano Salinas, who was at that time a high-ranking member of NXIVM, by the way, the son of a former Mexican president, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, that is where he's getting married. So there's a bunch of NXIVM members who see Daniela there, and Lauren goes up to her, and she's like, oh, are you still doing your program? And she just basically kind of is like, oh yeah, whatever. And at that point, Daniela has moved on. She's become very successful. She's gotten out, as I understand it. She is thriving, as I understand it. I know Moira Papenza, the lead prosecutor on the case, has tweeted that basically at the time of the trial, she was running a successful company with 250 workers, and has since become more successful. So she's come out of this on the right end, and she has never really spoken a lot about it. During the episode, you hear many things, and Keith telling Daniela how to lose weight. This is someone who looks like there's literally not an ounce of fat on her body, and Keith is telling her she needs to lose weight, and that having an abortion, well, yeah, that's a good way to lose weight. I mean, it's just so, mind-boggling when you hear this stuff.
And telling her and other people allegedly that they're Olympic athletes who get pregnant just so they can get abortions as a weight loss technique. That is...
This is semi-professional athlete. I have some issues with the truth of that statement. That was just a very disturbing statement.
And it goes to what, of course, we know, and I'm not sure if it's going to be dealt with in the finale, which is that Raniere and NXIVM basically had, not to be flip about it, but sort of a jumbo saver plan at a local women's health clinic where, women within the organization were just brought as a matter of course to get abortions after they got pregnant, allegedly by Keith Raniere.
And that's going to be part of the evidence against Keith, is that, so Pamela Kefritz, she was this person very close with Keith, and she's someone with, extremely high ranking in the organization. She handled abortions. So between the three sisters, and by the way, the oldest sister of these three is still with Keith Raniere and has a child with Keith Raniere. And by the way, Daniela's father, we should not go by without mentioning this, is still to this day, at least as of the sentencing of Keith Raniere, was still loyal to Keith Raniere and wrote a letter on his behalf to the federal sentencing judge. His daughters, between the three of them, there were 4 abortions. And those abortions included documentation in which Pamela Kefritz basically said to Daniela that in no certain terms you are not to say Keith was the father. The younger sister says that she was with her boyfriend for an X period of time. And that's part of the evidence that's going to show, if you do the math, this was a 45-year-old man with a 15-year-old girl.
I think this episode, there's very little of Mark Agnifilo, but it's pretty clear that at this point in the trial, he knows that his client is in very bad trouble. And there's a great moment where he's interviewed outside the courthouse, and he says, well, it just kind of depends on whether or not more, bad evidence and bad facts come out, because that's definitely going to affect the jury. It's like, yeah, that will happen at trial.
That might happen, Mark.
I'm not 100% convinced he believed what he was saying at that point.
Yeah, I talked to Mark throughout the trial and since, and honestly, it's funny watching The Vow. If you had never spoken to Mark Agnifilo, you'd be like, this guy's cold. This guy's a defense attorney, but where is he? Is he at? Where's he coming from? And honestly, he was like the nicest person in the world during the trial. I mean, it's funny. I spoke to him a lot before, during, after, and he even after the trial actually shook Barbara Boucher's hand, which really upset local attorney Steve Coffey around here by doing that. So it's just interesting to see how Mark comes off, and he comes off kind of cold on The Vow. But my personal experience with him is that he was a very nice guy. They obviously had their work cut out for them at this trial. I don't think it's an easy case to defend, but at the same time, it is interesting to watch Mark on TV really just act like this is, hey, this could be, I know it looks bad, but those things, I think at one point he said causing pain is not illegal.
And that is true. That is true.
It is not
specifically illegal, but all right. Well, listen, let's leave it there with one more episode to go next week. Thanks very much for listening to NXIVM on Trial, a Times Union podcast. I'm Casey Seiler.
I'm Jessica Marshall.
I'm Rob Gavin.
It's been 15 years since 12-year-old Shalik Rainwalker vanished. His disappearance from rural upstate New York was ruled a probable child homicide. But no one has ever been charged, and his body has never been found. This is Rainwalker, the Lost Boy. I'm Jessica Marshall.
And I'm Wendy Libertor.
In this podcast from the Times-Union, we'll take a deep dive into this mystery, the case of a missing child that has unsettled New York's capital region and beyond for more than a decade.
Coming soon, wherever you listen to podcasts.